Nō mai, haere mai, welcome. I'm Bruce Munro, and with me is International Relations Specialist Professor Robert Patman, and this is Global Insight. Welcome to a new year of Global Insight. What do the next 12 months hold? What are the events that we should keep an eye on? Let's hear from Professor Patman. Welcome, Robert.
Morena, Bruce. Thank you.
What are your predictions for the conflicts in Israel and Ukraine?
That's two difficult conflicts to predict. I think the conflict in Gaza will come to a conclusion or end ahead of the Ukraine one. I think the pressure's already building. There's been 2 UN Security Council resolutions demanding a ceasefire. The US has twice vetoed it, but I think the pressure's still there. And it's beginning to affect domestic politics in the United States. There's an abandoned Biden movement by people who are furious that their tax dollars are contributing to the arming of what they see as a disproportionate Israeli response to a terrorist atrocity committed by Hamas on the 7th of October. So I think the America will come under pressure to limit its support. But I think the other thing here is I think Israel can't sustain this campaign for too long. The objective of the campaign is to annihilate Hamas. Well, that was always a fantasy. They're not going to annihilate Hamas. And that the penny is beginning to drop. Of course, cynics would say they never intended to annihilate Hamas. This right-wing Netanyahu government actually wants to effectively, under that slogan, damage Gaza to a point where it's uninhabitable and drive the population out and then reoccupy the territory. We'll have to wait and see on that, but I think the Americans will come under increasing pressure. It's election year in 2024 in the United States for the Israelis to wind up their campaign. So I think that's going to occur. I wouldn't like to put a timeline on it. I think the present momentum cannot be sustained for too long. Ukraine, many people saw as a bit of a stalemate in 2023. I think I'm a great believer in a Prussian strategist called Karl von Clausewitz, and he always said the defenders have the advantage against the attackers in a long-term war. I still think that is in play. I think the Ukrainians, there's a lot of uncertainties. The Americans may cut back their support, particularly if Mr. Trump gets elected in the US. But I think they are incrementally doing a lot of damage to the Russian position. Also, the Russian situation at the moment is pretty grim internally. A number of apartment buildings have suffered power cuts with temperatures of minus 27. We're talking about no power for days. And people are getting quite upset about it. And an authoritarian regime is not as responsive as a democratic one, but I think Mr. Putin's going to come under a real pressure this year. So I see more of the same in Ukraine. But I think it's not so much a stalemate, but I think there'll be incremental gains by Ukraine. Whether it'll be a breakthrough will remain to see. I still think Ukraine, over time, will gradually get the upper hand over the occupying forces of Russia in the east.
What other important events do you see on the horizon for 2024?
I think there's a very important election in Taiwan on Saturday, the 13th of January. And its neighbour, the People's Republic of China, has a big interest in that outcome. So there's a lot at play there. There's been some concern for some time in many countries, including New Zealand, that China may seek to annex Taiwan at some point. And there's no doubt about it, they've been trying to influence the election there, but apparently with no great success. So be interesting to see who prevails in Taiwan. And the major thing is that I think for a democratic election to go ahead, a free and fair election with a widely accepted outcome. And that looks like it's going to happen. But it's certainly, it's an important landmark, I think, in relations between the People's Republic of China and Taiwan.
Any other important events that we should be keeping our eye on?
Yeah, I think one I mentioned, the presidential election in the US, which I actually think is more unpredictable than many people realise. At the moment, everybody seems to be assuming, not everyone, but a lot of people quite reasonably assuming it's going to be a contest between a rerun of the previous election of a confrontation between Biden and Trump, who are both ageing candidates. I think there may be a surprise packet because Mr. Biden's support came. One of the things that really helped him defeat Trump by 7 million votes last time round was the number of young people who voted for him. Those young people, many of them who are actively inclined, seem to be quite upset about Mr. Biden's policy of unconditional support for Israel, particularly when war crimes apparently have been committed. And it's not just young Muslims who may switch their vote. It's young people in general. And the protests in favour of Palestine have been quite significant in the US. And there's this abandoned Biden movement that's gathered momentum. Now, that could do one of two things. It could force the administration to rethink its policy. That may be happening. On the other hand, it may also pave the way for an independent candidate. Robert Kennedy is running as an independent, formerly Democrat. But there are some other interesting candidates that could emerge. So I think the situation there may be less predictable than we think. I also still, on balance, believe that Mr. Trump may not necessarily be the nominee for the Republican Party, simply because of the legal morass he finds himself in.
Are there other trends and forces at play that you think could affect international affairs this year?
Yes, there's long-term trends which will continue to shape the world in which we live. One that we're very familiar with, intensified globalization, this process of interconnectedness that makes the world seem an ever smaller place through advances in communications and digital technology. We are seeing AI emerge, and this is something of a game changer, but it's part of the globalization process. There's not going to be any reverse. The globalization process, despite what some populist politicians say, is not going to be reversed. You could no more deglobalize than you could deindustrialize. And so I think that's a trend that's going to continue to play out. We'll be reacting to new possibilities in the AI field and other aspects of globalization. I think much of the technology we're using at the moment will probably be somewhat dated in the not too distant future. We've got the possibility of quantum computers in the near future, which will make a tremendous difference in terms of speed and power. The other big trend, of course, is climate change. We've just seen the hottest year recorded ever since records have been kept. I think that's going to encroach on politics in a way that we don't anticipate. Many politicians have set themselves against substantively addressing climate change. They may well be forced by the fact that their constituents are experiencing first-hand the consequences of climate change, whether it be extreme flooding, winds, just people having their lives turned upside down. And this is a big agricultural country, so that's another area. So I do think that climate change it may not make an immediate impact in 2024, but I think it's going to be another year in which climate change as an issue in global politics will continue to rise in importance.
Looking at early indications from New Zealand's coalition government, what role do you see New Zealand taking on the world stage this year?
Difficult to predict, but we're still in the early stages, and I don't think foreign policy has been their top priority so far. Mr. Peters has indicated he wants to strengthen the relationship strategically with the United States. We're not quite sure what that means. Does that mean joining Pillar 2 of AUKUS? Does it mean just working more closely with the United States in the Pacific? Let's be quite clear. The reason I'm slightly sceptical here is that this government already inherited a very strong relationship with the United States. So there's not too much to repair there. The relationship with Australia looks good. The one thing that it remains to be seen. But if we look at the rhetoric of this government, Mr. Luxon wants this government to be much more activist in getting the New Zealand message across globally. We haven't seen so much evidence of that so far, but it could come, and it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. But there are the possibility of conflicting objectives within this government.
Right. Can I ask, what do you think that Mr. Luxon sees as the New Zealand message?
I think he sees the message as being a more reliable partner of the United States and Australia. I'm puzzled by that because I don't think we've been seen as unreliable. We've been seen as different, but most countries claim to have an independent foreign policy. I think that Mr. Luxon and Mr. Peters will bump up against certain constraints that they've underestimated. For example, at the moment, the government talks as it has complete freedom to possibly explore and sign Pillar 2 of AUKUS. But that will bump up against other key objectives of the government, which is deepening relations with the Pacific Island states, many of whom have made it quite clear they're not happy about that prospect. And then, of course, you have a tension between Mr. Peters and Mr. Luxon on the US-China relationship. Mr. Peters, at every opportunity so far, has tried to indicate a closer identification with the United States on the grounds that the US is a democracy, although one that was severely shaken by the events of 6th of January 2021. Mr. Luxon has said he wants to improve the relationship with China because it's our major trading partner and it'd be good to consolidate that. So there's a bit of a tension there. Will Mr. Luxon's vision of maintaining a much more even-handedness between the US and China, and perhaps, if anything, giving China a bit of a boost, will that prevail? Or will Mr. Peters tilt towards the United States at the expense of China prevail? It remains to be seen. But to be fair, it's the early stages of the government. It usually takes a government about a year to find its feet in foreign affairs.
What is New Zealand's recent track record on the conflict in Gaza?
Mixed. We've done the right thing by voting for 2 ceasefires, humanitarian ceasefires, in the UN General Assembly, which are not binding, of course. But I would have liked to have seen this government publicly calling for an immediate ceasefire. And I think that New Zealand should be saying to the United States, please think again about providing arms to Israel in a one-sided conflict in which large numbers of Palestinians are being killed. 23,000, and about 10,000 of those are children, which had nothing to do with the events, the horrific events of the 7th of October. So in other words, this is a disproportionate response, and it's not in the interest of liberal democracies, particularly when war crimes are being committed, to continue this current conflict.
Thank you, Robert.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. Catch us next time on Global Insight. Te pono me te araha.